In Genesis 18, three mysterious figures appear out of nowhere to Abraham. Who are these mysterious men? Is one of these figures really God in visible human form? There are many details in this passage that often get overlooked. So if we want to know what's really happening here with God and Sodom and how Abraham is part of all this, we need to dig a little bit deeper. Let's jump into Genesis 18 to see what it is that God is really doing. In Genesis chapter 18, we're going to see some pretty cool things. Starting in verse 1, it says, "The Lord appeared to him," Abraham, "by the oaks of Mamre." This is the location. This is where Abraham is as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. A couple things to note is in the next chapter, in chapter 19, when two angels are sent to visit Sodom and Gomorrah and really validate the outcry against them, we're going to see that Lot is sitting in the city gates, presumably having some influence in that city as a kind of judge or authority figure. So I just like to parallel that to Abraham here sitting at the door of his tent while Lot is sitting in the city gates. And it says that God appears in the heat of the day, at this point, in this place, to this person. This is very different than when God appears to Adam and Eve in the garden right after they sin. It says that God was walking in the cool of the day right after they sinned in Genesis 3. So there might be something to parallel between those two ideas and details in the stories. That's some homework for you guys. I just want to note some things that we should pay attention to. It says, "He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, three men were standing." And this is where a lot of people want to know, hey, is this the Trinity? Hey, is this God? Hey, is this Jesus pre-incarnate? Hey, is one of these men actually God showing up to Abraham? Well, we just said that saw the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. So if he's appearing, likely that, or it is reasonable to conclude that there could be a visible element to this, where Abraham is experiencing God in this very visible way. And all of a sudden, three men are standing in front of him. Now look at what it says. It says, when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. In other words, Abraham definitely recognizes who he's in the presence of by the fact that he bows his face to the ground. So I have a question. Did these three figures just suddenly appear? Were they walking and Abraham just suddenly realized that they were walking towards him? Because it says that God appeared two other times in Genesis before this moment. God has appeared to Abraham. But this interaction seems a bit different since God shows up with two other figures. And that has not happened yet in Genesis or in Abraham's story. And Abraham is able to show physical hospitality after visibly seeing God here. So it seems as though it makes the most sense to conclude one of these men is God in visible human form somehow. And said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought in, and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on. Right? So a question I have is, does Abraham doubt that he's found favor in God's sight? Because this is what Moses will ask on Mount Sinai. He'll say, God, if I found favor in your sight, let me see your glory. And then Abraham seems to be asking God to stay a while. And he's going to prepare a meal and bring some water, and he's essentially preparing a kind of sacrifice, and he's asking God to regard his offering that he intends to bring, which does sound reminiscent of Cain and Abel, where Cain is wanting God to regard his offering the way that God regarded Abel's offering. So this is what it means, at least, for God to not pass by Abraham. And Abraham does admit that he's the servant. So that might be another indication that, number one, Abraham realizes who he's talking to or who he's in the presence of. And also, if he's going to bow down and say, I'm your servant, it is likely one of these people really is God. I don't know if the Trinitarian view of Father, Son, and Spirit here in visible human form makes the most sense, but we can at least start with God as one of these individuals. And he says, let a little water be brought, which is interesting. Jesus will talk about later in the Gospels, he'll separate the goats from the sheep, and this just came to mind. And he'll essentially, the one of the differences between the two groups of the sheep and the goats is that the faithful, righteous, gave a cup of cold water to those who were the least of these in the name of Jesus. And so what we have here is Abraham showing hospitality. If God is appearing with these two angels, I have a question. How can they physically have their feet washed with water? And then why does Abraham choose to do this? Of all the things he could do, why is this his first response? I know who's here. Let me wash your feet. Let me bring you food. Let me bring you water. It seems as though Abraham is offering not just a sacrifice of sorts, but he says that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on. Rest yourselves under the tree. So there's a connection between the tree, the bread, being refreshed, resting, and having their feet washed, and having water brought for that all to happen. Abraham is offering hospitality. This is an image, I think, a foreshadowing of sorts of what God brings us or does through his Son. Jesus is the eternal bread of God that brings life. Jesus is the eternal washing that gives the life of God through this water that washes our hearts and souls. Jesus is the eternal rest of God. Jesus is the eternal garden presence of God under the tree of life again. So if this image of a tree, or here's a question, is this image of a tree, particularly, he said it's the oaks of Mamre that he's by, which I think has spiritual significance. This is sacred space. This notes some kind of interaction between humanity and the divine. So is this image of a tree particularly symbolic here, with God resting underneath it? And again, the question is, does Abraham know this is God? I think he does. He recognizes that I'm your servant. I'll bow down to the ground. I'll bring a kind of offering. And Abraham knows God's on mission, so I don't know where Abraham thinks God is going, because he says, then you may pass on. To where? Where does he think he's going? Either way, he says, so they said, I love it, it's they, almost like in unison, in agreement, do as you've said, which, that might lend credence to the not typical, but the Trinitarian view where Father, Son, and Spirit are here, or in Genesis we see them saying, let us make man in our image. I don't know if that's as convincing for me, but I can see why people would reason through this. It says, Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah. Now we are 6 verses in, Sarah comes into the picture. And he says, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, make cakes. And she's probably like, what is happening? And Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and good, gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Which, if I'm going to think of anything that has this kind of language, the parable of the prodigal son essentially has this exact language where the father sees the son afar off, coming towards him. After embracing him, he tells the servants, go quickly, prepare a calf, not a golden calf, prepare a calf, because this son of mine who was lost is found, who was dead, he's alive. And Abraham ran. So I think there might be correlation to that, as I've, in previous videos, I've made that connection. Go watch our prodigal son video. Or rather, I call it the good father, because he's the focus. And they prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he'd prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree. For some reason, this tree has been brought into focus 3 times. He's by the oaks of Mamre, which, if I'm not mistaken, that is where he was when he got news that Lot was taken captive. So he's back here. And we saw in verse 4, come rest under the tree, and now they're under the tree while they're eating. The fact that they're eating under a tree, God is present, you should be thinking of a number of stories that have those different elements. But this whole scene is very similar to someone bringing God a sacrifice, because we have what is likely some kind of sacred space or viewed as some kind of spiritual place where humanity can interact with the divine and God is present. And so God will talk about in the Old Testament, he'll tell the Israelites, go and, tear down the altars and the Asherim and the high places of the pagans, which are on high mountains, which are on the hills and under the green trees. So there are times where trees are associated with sacred spaces, not always pagan in nature. Sometimes it is God, in fact, meeting someone. Kind of like when Jesus saw Philip under a tree, or was it Nathaniel? I forget. Or other instances, we have Adam and Eve with the tree of life in the garden, and God's there. So just a few things to think about. Or when Elijah's resting under the whatever kind of tree he's resting under, and the angel meets him and feeds him. So either way, this kind of terebinth tree, if you do your research and go study this, the terebinth tree in Scripture is usually often associated with, again, worship and sacred space. So the question becomes, are we supposed to see this as God sharing a meal with his chosen one, Abraham, and he accepts the offering? Unlike Cain in Genesis 4, he accepts the offering like Abel. Are we supposed to view Abraham in that light? I think so. Verse 9 says, they said to him, where is Sarah your wife? Notice the they again. So in unison, these three are asking, where is Sarah your wife? Well, we just saw Sarah prepared the meal. Why is the first question they ask, where's Sarah? Why does it matter where Sarah is? And if God knows where Sarah is, why is he asking? Because this seems at least reminiscent of how God asks Adam, Adam, where are you, right? Or in Genesis 4, God asks Cain, Cain, where is your brother Abel? And in both contexts, God is inviting the individual to be honest about where they're at and what they've done, admit their mistakes. So the last time we've seen Sarah, beyond just making the meal right here, is in Genesis 16, where she conspires with Abraham to abuse Hagar for their own selfish purposes. So it makes sense that this is God meeting Sarah where she is after what she did for whatever reason. I think at least God is addressing the doubts that are present in Sarah in this passage. We'll see Sarah laugh, we'll see Sarah doubt, we'll see Sarah really not believe that she can have a child. But also it seems as though if we're to kind of liken this question, where is Sarah your wife? Again, we don't see anything really similar to that up to this point, 18 chapters into Genesis, except with Adam and Cain. And both involved failure and God trying to bridge the gap and invite them to come and be honest about what they've done. And I wonder if that's happening with Sarah here, because God repeats this promise. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year. He's talking to Abraham. And Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. That's great, but she's old and her womb is dusty. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. We've already seen this over and over. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I'm worn out, which is a nice way of saying super old, my Lord is old. Shall I have pleasure? Like, am I going to have a child? Is that even possible? See, God repeats the promise that he made in Genesis 17 with Abraham, which seems to indicate this is more or less for Sarah to overhear. So Sarah was listening at the door. It seems as though God wants Sarah to hear this, which is why he only states the promise after asking, where is Sarah? Not that God didn't know, but again, this is similar to what's about to happen in the end. At the end of this chapter, Abraham will overhear God speaking about his plan to destroy Sodom. And here Sarah overhears what God says to Abraham. And after all that has transpired up to this point, Sarah is still not convinced. She still doesn't believe I can have a child. She's doubting. And it seems as though part of this visitation is for God to address that and confirm his promises and make it very clear. And you're going to have a child, whether you like it or not. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah just laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? What's interesting is that God asks Abraham. He doesn't yell, hey, Sarah, why did you laugh? It's as if Abraham has, I don't know, I guess here's a question. Does Abraham have any control over what's happening here? Because it sounds similar, once again, to Genesis 3, where the man is somewhat held accountable for what happened between the serpent and Eve. And is there a sense in which Abraham is also not just responsible for Sarah's doubts, not that he can control her faith, but Abraham has either told Sarah what God promised and Sarah didn't believe, or he hasn't told her yet. Those are really our only two options. He either told her she didn't believe, or she hasn't yet known. And this is the first time she's hearing about it. But either way, Abraham has a role in this, not at all to control whether or not she believes, but at least to kind of convey the information. And God's here to make it clear, you're going to have a kid. Sarah denied it after she said, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I'll return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. So obviously she's not just within ear distance, she's actually within speaking distance to be a part of the conversation. So he said, no, but you did laugh. Which I question, hey, why does God need to point out her laughter and address the fact that she's lying about that? Again, it seems like part of this visitation is to remind Abraham of the promise and to convince Sarah of it. It's a reminder for Abraham. It's evidence for Sarah, confirmation for Sarah. Hey, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you on our website at abovereproachministry.com. Maybe you want to learn how to study the Bible. We have free Bible classes just for you. Are you maybe a newer believer? Go ahead and check out our Christianity 101 Foundations course. Maybe you hate videos. Well, we have a podcast, so you can listen to all of our messages on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Maybe you want to join or start a discussion group. Check out our map of all the current armed discussion groups all around the world. And do you maybe live near Greenville, South Carolina? If you do, you should check out our church on Friday nights. Visit movementchurchsc.com for more information. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, or head over to the donate page and donate through debit or credit card, PayPal, Cash App, Venmo, Patreon, or even mail a check to P.O. Box 509 Inman, South Carolina. And if you want to make a ministry connection, feel free to reach out to me on our website. All right, I know that was a lot, but I'm done. So let's get back to the video. Then the men set out from there and they looked down towards Sodom. I just wonder why God had to make this clear. You did laugh. You did laugh. Very weird. Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? It's like, well, you can't now because I heard. What are you hiding? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. Part of God's reasoning for sharing his plans with Abraham is that Abraham's going to end up being a great nation himself. So it seems as though God is inviting Abraham into his plans, at least for this reason, because he'll be a great nation. So is this because Abraham needs to know how God governs and rules? Because God is about to handle injustice and violence in the city, and if Abram is going to become a nation, he'll need to know God's justice and God's ways. And in fact, what we're about to see is that God says Abraham has been commissioned to teach his offspring and descendants the ways of God. For I've chosen him, Abraham, for what? Well, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord. And that's not just the covenant of circumcision in the last chapter, but specifically it's doing righteousness and justice, which is what God has always been about from the beginning, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he's promised him. And so if we think about the priests and prophets of Israel, part of their responsibility was to instruct and teach the people of God the ways and the commandments of God. And this is part of what it means to be a priest. So Abraham seems to be commissioned or called or chosen as a kind of priestly prophet figure to instruct his children and future generations in the way of God to be blessed. And the question I have is, it says that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he's promised, which are all these blessings and sorts. So the blessing does seem connected to the instruction of God. The blessing seems connected to the people of God keeping God's ways and doing what is right. And doing right here is learning justice and righteousness. So it seems what makes the most sense is that God is about to use this example, this opportunity for Abraham he's using this as a teaching moment to bring Abraham into what he's about to do to Sodom. And he's going to instruct Abraham in the way of justice and righteousness. So God is going to bring Abraham what he promised, but it seems to be conditioned upon Abraham teaching his children to keep the way of God, do righteousness and justice. So is God's promise conditional here? It seems so. This seems to be a chance for Abraham to exercise his knowledge of God, flex his really understanding of God's ways, and apply the wisdom he's gleaned from his experience with God so far. Abraham is invited to exercise justice and righteousness, and you're going to see Abraham doing that now. Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, there's an outcry that is related to their sin. I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. So I have a question. What is this outcry God is speaking of? Where is it coming from? Who is it coming from? We've seen the innocent blood of Abel in Genesis 4 crying out from the ground. There's an outcry against Cain. And the violent bloodshed in Noah's day crying out against that generation. That's what brought about God's justice, is the blood cries out from the ground, it seems, in that story. And later on, we'll see the Israelites crying out, and their outcry reaches heaven, so God comes down and rescues them from Egypt. So it seems reasonable to suggest that innocent blood might be crying out against the land of Sodom here, because God does mention their sin and the outcry, and whether they've done all together. I want to say there's going to be a mention of the violence. I could be wrong. I'm just looking. Suppose 50, suppose 30. I guess we'll see. Maybe I'm missing it. Either way, something to consider about the previous chapter is that the way God found Hagar, right? Hagar was abused. Hagar was mistreated. He found Hagar, cared for her personally, which is what God typically does for the oppressed and the abused. So it seems reasonable to at least consider that maybe Hagar's mistreatment and abuse was a kind of outcry against Abraham and Sarah. And God, yes, he's visiting the outcry against Sodom, but there's also, because of the previous chapter, an outcry. Is it the previous chapter? Chapter 16, 2 chapters ago. There's this kind of outcry, this cry for justice for what was done to Hagar. And God answers. So maybe Hagar's mistreatment and abuse is a part of this. But again, who is bringing this outcry to God? Why does God need to verify it as if he doesn't know? Considering again Hagar's mistreatment, that prompted God's action to find her and care for her. And is this possibly part of the reason God visits Abraham and Sarah here? Is it to verify not just Sodom, but the outcry that Hagar has against them? Because in chapter 16, verse 8, she literally says to the angel of the Lord, I'm fleeing from my mistress, Sarah, which implies because of her abuse. So we've seen God going down and visiting Babel in chapter 11, because right here he says in verse 21, I will go down. Well, he's already come down in chapter 11 to see what's happening with Babel. So Sodom must be similar in some ways to what happened with Babel. And God seems to be evaluating the case to bring justice and righteous judgment based on the evidence brought forth through Sodom and the people there. It's as if the people of Sodom have a chance to show this is indeed the case and prove that, or act differently and change, like Nineveh when Jonah came to preach. And something to consider is that God helped Abraham have victory over the wicked pagan kings that took Lot, his nephew, and they were coming against the king of Sodom and Gomorrah. And now these people that Abraham indirectly helped and saved with the help of God, they're about to be destroyed by fire. So maybe that was a second chance of sorts for the people of Sodom, for the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, a second chance of sorts through the redemptive work God brought through Abraham, right? Abraham rescued them from the captivity. Abraham rescued them from being defeated and conquered and gave them liberation and victory and sent them back home in a different liberated condition. So it seems to be they had a second chance and they're blowing it. So verse 22, it says, the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. So is the Lord among these men as one of them, or is he distinct from the men? Like, is God's presence just in the midst of them, or is he actually one of these men in visible human form? Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous in the city. Will you sweep away the place and not spare it for 50 righteous who are in it? Like, far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked? Like, that's not just. God has just talked about justice and righteousness, and Abraham will become a nation, and now Abraham is demonstrating what he knows about God. So a question I have, he says, far be it from you so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shouldn't the judge of all the earth do what is just? Now hold on, it seems as though Abraham has a higher moral standard than God, which I don't believe is happening. I don't think that's what's truly taking place. But I do have a question. Is Abraham questioning God's justice here? Or is Abraham just questioning the plans and intent of God? Or is it possibly both? Verse 26, and the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I'll spare the place for their sake. God will be actively looking for the righteous people now to spare the city. In other words, he's not looking for reason to condemn the city. He's looking for reasons to save the city now. Just like Nineveh was spared because of their faith in the message and repentance, or Noah's family was spared at the flood, but their righteousness, Noah's family wasn't righteous enough to spare the ancient world, right? Now the question I have is, why does Abraham start with 50 righteous? And so what we do see about God is he does spare regions, cities, civilizations, communities for the sake of the righteous who are present. Like there is a wisdom principle, there's revelation of God's character and heart here, in that God does at times spare said group for the righteous that are in there, in that city or community or civilization. Abraham answered and said, okay, I've undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. It's interesting, we've already seen God make man from dust. That's probably what Abraham is referring to. Abraham is right, he is but dust. But could the ashes reference possibly be foreshadowing Lot's wife in the next chapter? She'll be turned into a pillar of salt. Some people think that's literally the whatever chemicals in the ground mixing with the fire. The stuff in the ground, I can't think right now, but either way, some people think she's literally turned into a pillar of salt because of the ground there, but I would suggest she's actually at least being somewhat destroyed by fire, which could imply ashes. She's turned into a pile of ashes, maybe not. I've heard that view, but either way, could this possibly be foreshadowing that? Maybe. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And God said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. What's interesting, and this is not Jonah's heart when he's sent to Nineveh. Jonah looks for reason to destroy the city. He does not look for reason to save it. Again, he spoke, okay, God, how about 40? God said, for 40, I won't do it. Okay, God, don't be angry. Let me speak. How about 30 are found there? God said, I won't do it if I find 30. Okay, I've undertaken to speak to the Lord. How about 20? For the sake of 20, I won't destroy it. So you see the pattern. Now you see the repetition. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again one more time. Suppose 10 are found there. God answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. Why did Abraham stop at 10? Did he really think there was no way Sodom wouldn't have 10 righteous people? Why is Abraham even concerned for a wicked city that's known for their sin and evil? We know why. Because Lot, his nephew, is there. And he's already rescued Lot once. He's already shown grace to Lot by giving him the best of the land. He's already taken Lot and cared for Lot and done so much for Lot. And now he's concerned. Abraham is acting as an intercessor here. He's interceding for his nephew in Sodom that doesn't know judgment is coming. Abraham is set forth as a kind of Moses, as a kind of mediating figure. We see Daniel do this with the nation of Israel, praying for him and his people. We see so many different mediating figures, like Elijah, like the high priest, like eventually Jesus, the ultimate mediator of a new covenant. Abraham, as the chosen partner God is working with at this point, as the father of the faith, Abraham is proving that he understands at least enough of God's justice and righteousness to intercede for and step in the place of Lot by, bringing his case before God. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. A question I have is, where exactly was God going? Because verse 21 tells us he's going to see the outcry against Sodom, but only the 2 angels are the ones who are sent. So is God going there? Is he going somewhere else? Either way, we're going to see judgment come upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and God is overseeing that, and he's dispatched his angels to really see what's going on. Not that God doesn't know, but there's a lot of partnership taking place here in this chapter. There's a lot of God giving responsibility to spiritual beings, to his chosen partner, to letting him in on the plans, letting him intercede, letting him be a part and kind of speak into what he's doing. Not that God needs counsel, But this is the nature of God, is to invite, to partner with image bearers. Not that we have a say or we have any power, but it's a gracious opportunity to partner with God in his work in the world. Abraham is a mediator. He's an intercessor. And he's demonstrating what it looks like to have the heart of God and exercise justice and righteousness even after failing 2 chapters ago. Even after messing up, he gets back up, continues following God, and God is gracious to meet him in these different spaces and places. So that's Genesis 18. I will see you guys in the next study where we will tackle Genesis chapter 19. Hey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more biblical content just like this. We have hundreds of videos, but you might be most interested in these ones right here. Also, visit our website for all of our free resources and classes. And thank you so much for partnering with us financially to make this ministry even possible. Keep moving towards Jesus, and I'll see you in the next video.